You're listening to the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast, episode 164. Welcome to the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast. I'm your host, Paula Price, lawyer turned certified executive coach. This podcast was created to empower women lawyers just like you to create a life and practice you love. Join me every week for a break from the hustle so we can focus on you, what you truly want, and how you can create it. If you're over the overwhelm, done with putting out fires, and ready to redefine success on your own terms, you're in the right place. Ready for today's episode? Let's dive in. Would you identify yourself as a perfectionist? If so, where do you find that it's holding you back? For example, do you find that you procrastinate and put things off because you're afraid you won't be able to do them perfectly? Or do you find that you get started okay, but then you obsess over every detail and burn well past the time estimate that you gave yourself? Do you find that you spend a disproportionate amount of your time putting out fires or dealing with unhappy clients on projects that don't really align with your broader goals? Or maybe you're stuck on a career decision. You know you want to go ahead with it, you have a plan, but you're paralyzed from taking action by fear of the unknown. If you answered yes to any of these questions, then you will be delighted to hear about a powerful antidote to perfectionism. It is the Pareto Principle. And in today's podcast episode, I am going to share with you how you can use the Pareto Principle to manage your perfectionism, or if you're not fully a perfectionist, perhaps your perfectionistic tendencies to work more productively, to flourish at work, and to stop standing in your own way. So we're going to start with a couple of definitions. First of all, I would like to provide a definition of perfectionism. Now, chances are you understand what that means. You may be living with it and have a day-to-day understanding of what that is. Here, I would define it as a disposition to regard anything short of perfection as unacceptable. And that comes from the Merriam-Webster Online Dictionary. Now, what you'll find with perfectionism is that it can often lead to an excessive focus on minor details and an overwhelming desire to achieve flawless results. And that can turn out to be counterproductive, right? As a perfectionist, you have the best of intentions, you want things to be perfect, and that can actually lead to holding you back. Now, the Pareto Principle, maybe you've heard this before. It is a principle that was developed by an Italian economist named Vilfredo Pareto, and he came up with this concept. He realized that 80% of the land in Italy was owned by 20% of Italy's population. And this went on to other studies and other observations of the Pareto Principle in effect in economics and in other areas, whether it's in science, whether it's in nature, whether it's in human activities. And so the idea is that 20% of the causes create 80% of the effects. So, for example, you might find that 80% of your problems at work come from 20% of your files. Or you might also notice that 80% of your client billings come from 20% of your clients. So the idea there is starting to look at the 80% that is created by the 20%. And in today's lesson, what I'm going to do is I'm going to help you take this simple concept from something that is intangible, something that is nice in theory, and I would like to help you learn how to apply it to real examples in your practice. And I'm going to use 3 examples today. The first example is how to use your time more efficiently. The second is how to increase the quality of your working relationships. And the third is to overcome goal saboteurs. And we're going to dive into each of these in sequence, starting with how to use your time more efficiently. Now, before I explain this, I would just like to offer that for each of you, if you have perfectionistic tendencies and you can see this Pareto Principle being something that is really helpful to you, what I would encourage you to do is to think about the examples that I'm sharing with you and also think about the specific examples in your practice where you can apply the same thinking, you can apply the same tool. So just bear that in mind as we go through the example. And here we are starting with time. So here's the problem. As a perfectionist, what you might find is that you have a very long to-do list, and you write down all those things that you have to do, and then you find a way to program yourself to get everything done. Now, if you're doing this without a further layer of analysis, what you might find is that you're really, really good at getting everything done. But the problem is that you're spending equal time on things that are important as things that maybe are not as important. So what that can lead to is that you feel exhausted because you're working really hard, but you're not necessarily getting great results. Now, why this can happen is that as a perfectionist, you may have a strong tendency to want to please people. So when people ask you to do something, your automatic response is to say yes and add it to your list. Then, after you've taken on all these different projects, you then have this desire to make everything perfect. So you find that you obsess over every detail, aiming for flawless outcomes, even in areas that may not be as critical. So that leads you to taking on more than you have capacity for in the first place, and then spending an excessive amount of time trying to make everything perfect. So the solution here is to take that Pareto Principle, to take that 80-20 rule and shift the focus away from trying to be perfect and please everybody around you to prioritizing the tasks that have the greatest impact. So there's two things that you're going to want to do here, two major themes. The first is prioritizing. What I would invite you to do here is to think about how the Pareto Principle applies to the tasks that you have on your desk right now. If you've got your to-do list handy, you might even take a look at it. And I invite you to think about what are the 80% results that you can achieve by applying 20% of the effort. When you ask yourself that question, you now have a filter to start identifying what those high yield tasks are. Then what you're going to want to do is invest your time, focus, and resources on perfecting these key areas rather than trying to achieve perfection in all of the other minor details. That's number one, is you want to prioritize the things that have the greatest impact. Now, the other side of this is reducing. I would invite you to think about what tasks are actually high cost. These are tasks that are really time consuming. They take up 80% of your time and they result in a 20% impact. And what I would invite you to do here is to delegate those tasks to somebody else or delete them entirely. Now, in order for you to identify the low value tasks and the high value tasks, I would encourage you to do a time audit. Now, the way to do that time audit is to look at what you spend your time on each day, see where time may be slipping. Some common causes for time slippage is email. So you might have a high volume of email traffic that you're dealing with, and maybe not all of those emails need to be responded to or be responded to with the level of detail that you are currently using. You might also find that there are people where you get pulled into conversations, you get pulled into problems, you get pulled into maybe files or discussions on files that don't actually move the dial forward. So what I'd invite you to do is to start thinking about that. What are the things that you can invest, the 20% tasks that are going to yield the 80% effort, and where are you putting 80% effort in to yield a 20% return? So that is going to be your task for item number one, which is to use your time more effectively. And I would invite you to think about this at a big picture perspective. One of the projects that I have on my own desk for the summer is to create a 5-year plan. This is something that I do every year. So I revisit my plan every year. I create a 1-year plan, and every 5 years, I create a new 5-year plan. One of the reasons that this is such an important exercise is that it allows me to step back and to see what the big needles are. So I would encourage you to have time that you spend looking at what the big needles are for your practice, whether it's creating a 1-year plan, a 3-year plan, a 5-year plan, but that's going to help you identify where those bigger levers are. Those big picture plans help you see whether or not you're spending your day-to-day in alignment with those bigger goals. So that was strategy number one, is making your use of time more productive. Now, the second is to use the Pareto Principle to increase the quality of your working relationships. How might this be a problem showing up in your work right now? Well, as a perfectionist, you may find that you approach your relationships from a black and white or all or nothing perspective. And you may see all matters, you may see all people, all relationships equally, and you're not necessarily making a concerted effort or taking a strategic approach in terms of where it is that you spend your time. But if you take a step back and look at your relationships, and we're here talking about relationships at work. So I'm thinking about your clients. I'm thinking about the lawyers that you work with who may be your internal clients, the ones that typically you would work with on a file. They generate work for you. Their clients are ones that they may refer over to you for your particular area of expertise. I'm also thinking about your external clients, the clients with whom you have a direct relationship outside of your firm, who you are serving. If you're not at a law firm, you're in-house, who are the lawyers or your colleagues that you work with most frequently. So you're wanting to look at the relationships you have within your working environment. And what I would invite you to consider is, who are the individuals with whom you do the most work? Where does 80% of your work come from? And is that reflected by 20% of the people that you're engaging with? I would also invite you to consider where your challenges are coming up, whether they're internal, whether they're external. Chances are, if you apply the Pareto Principle, you'll be able to identify that 80% of the challenges you're having are coming from 20% of your files. So here, what you might find is that you get distracted from working on your big projects because you're pulled away into putting out fires on files that may be relatively minor in the grand scheme of your career. They may be with clients or individuals that you don't work with very frequently. And you want to make sure that you're not spending 80% of your effort dealing with those situations at the expense of putting your time, energy, and focus into the relationships and projects that matter the most to you. Now, this happens because as a perfectionist, you want to be the go-to. You want to help people. You want to do an excellent job. And you want to do that no matter the task, right? Sometimes the desire to do things perfectly can overshadow the question of whether or not it's a project that you really should be doing in the first place. And you might find that you're unwilling to pare back or pull away from projects. And so what can happen is you can get sucked into a vortex working with the wrong clients on projects that don't necessarily align with your goals. So the solution here, very similar to the solution for time management, is to take 2 steps back and to say, okay, let's prioritize the relationships that matter most to you. So that means looking at the clients that you have a working relationship with. Again, these may be internal, they may be external, and identify those with whom you want to work most closely. And what I would then encourage you to do is to develop these relationships, prioritize these relationships, give them your time, give them your energy and your focus. What you might find, and you may have heard this if you've listened to marketing advice, there's this idea that you're better off nurturing your relationships with existing clients rather than trying to go out and seek new ones. Now, chances are in your practice, you do want to bring in new business, you do want to be growing your practice, but I would also encourage you to focus really, really clearly on the relationships that are already working for you. Now, this is something that I will often coach lawyers on when they are coming to me to discuss their strategies for growing their practice. And I think often when lawyers think about business development, they think about that external client. They think about the networking events where they're going to meet somebody new and they're going to form a relationship, and that relationship will eventually lead to file work, a client relationship. What I would invite you to consider is that is absolutely a wonderful thing to do, a wonderful approach to take, and that is often a long-term, long-game strategy. I would encourage you to focus as well on the immediate relationships that you already have and cultivate those relationships, because those are the relationships where they're already there, you're already receiving work, and you can strengthen those relationships by cultivating those relationships, doing excellent work for those individuals. So just keep that in mind as you're developing your relationships at work, is to use that 80-20 rule to focus on the 20% of the relationships that are creating 80% of your work. Now, at the same time, just like with time, we also looked at what we could reduce. I would invite you to think about where you may be getting distracted at work, which relationships may be pulling you away from other relationships that you would like to prioritize, and then find ways to slowly pull back from those projects and those relationships. So what that might mean is that maybe you're spending a little bit less time committed and nurturing certain relationships. It doesn't mean you have to cut them off entirely. It just means that you're being conscientious and deliberate about where you are focusing your attention. It may also mean that for certain files, particularly if it's a file in an area that you're not looking to cultivate, it's a practice area or a skill set, maybe you've already developed it and it's time to bring somebody junior on who can then take over that skill set, that part of your practice. Maybe it's an area that you're moving away from entirely. And again, you maybe want to find somebody that you can delegate that work to. So the idea here is to be strategic using that 80-20 rule. You do not have to do it all. And so if you're going to choose the 20% that yields the 80% results for you, ask yourself what that is and then move toward that. Again, it can be really helpful if you've done something like a 1-year plan or a 3 or 5-year plan. That will help you have that direction. You'll be able to see more clearly how you're going to delineate between what is most important and what is less important. Now, another note that is coming to me as I'm recording this podcast for you is where you are in your practice will help you understand that 80-20 rule. So when you're first starting out, chances are you have less discretion and less knowledge about where you want to draw the line. So this exercise, you can absolutely do it at an earlier stage of your practice. But what you might find is that there are less areas where you would necessarily be delegating or pulling away versus once you've been in practice for a few years or several years, that's where you're going to have even greater clarity about where it is that you want to go. You'll have longer relationships where you'll be able to see over time which ones are the ones that have been the most rewarding for you, professionally, personally, and that will give you more data points that you can use when you're doing this Pareto analysis and deciding where to focus your energy going forward. Now, finally, the third area where I would invite you to apply the Pareto Principle is in overcoming goal saboteurs. Now, what you might find here is that your perfectionistic approach is sabotaging the goals that you set for yourself. What that means is that 20% of the actions that you take or the actions that you do not take are creating 80% of your setbacks when it comes to reaching your goals. Now, this comes up in coaching conversations where clients know what they want, but then they take actions that sabotage themselves. An example that might resonate is, let's say you've made a decision to become really healthy. So you set up a routine where you're getting exercise, you've got your meal planning done so that you're making healthy choices, and then you're at home, it's the evening, you start watching TV and you get hooked on a show and it's really intriguing. And so you stay up to watch it. You stay up later and later. Next thing you know, it's past midnight and you finally go to bed and you realize that there's no way that you'll be able to wake up in time the next day to do your workout. And so you get up, but you get up late, you skip your workout. What you've effectively done is you've sabotaged your goal. You've sabotaged yourself because you stayed up too late watching that show. So even though you had the best of intentions, you had your plan in place, at the last moment, there was this thing that you did, that 20% that staying up too late is what is costing you, right? In terms of the bigger picture. Now, how might this show up at work? Well, it might be that you do all of the research. You prepare for an appearance in court and you're there, you're on your feet, and the judge asks you a question and you kind of know, but you don't really do a perfect job explaining it, right? You don't explain it as clearly as you could. Or where I see this often with clients that I work with is that you make a decision that you want to change jobs and you have your plan in place. You know what you need to do. You've got your CV lined up, but then you don't execute, right? Something there is holding you back. And what I have noticed is that the reason for this is that you may be stuck in black and white thinking, this all or nothing approach, and you may find that the uncertainty is causing you to stall. That is the 20% that is getting in the way. Now, there are a number of classic saboteurs that I see in my practice, and often they are feelings. So here's a list of the 20% that you might watch for. If you find that you are in situations where you've set a goal for yourself, where you are almost there, but you don't quite reach it, here are some of the things that might be holding you back. One is the urge or impulse, right, to do something else. You might find that you sit down at your computer and you're about to write an argument on, it's for a trial that's coming up, but it's not urgent. You've given yourself lots of time. And so you feel like, well, I don't really have to do it right now. Maybe you get distracted. There's, fresh coffee in the servery, or you go on to purchase that pair of sunglasses that you've been meaning to buy. You procrastinate. So this can be something that can stand between you and your goal. You have the goal, you know what you want to do, but this 20%, this impulse is holding you back. Often it's fear. So going back to the example of someone who's looking to find a new job, sometimes you ultimately feel at the end that sense of fear that has you talking yourself out of taking that next step. It might be fear that is keeping you from stating your opinion. You might be in a meeting with another lawyer or a group of lawyers. You're discussing strategy on a file. You've got an idea. You know it's a good idea, but you feel afraid that if you say it and other people don't like it, that you're going to feel inadequate, that it was not a very good suggestion. It might be fear of saying no, right? That you've got your boundaries, you know where you want to spend your time, but something comes to you, it's a bit of an outlier, and instead of saying no and sticking to your guns, you say yes to it, and that pulls you off course. It can be self-doubt, right? You know your stuff, but you doubt yourself, and that can show up unconsciously and lead other people to doubt you as well. It might be shiny penny syndrome. So this is where you're on path A and you're kind of unhappy and you have this fantasy, right? This idea that the grass is greener somewhere else. And so let's say it's your job. You are there. You are kind of happy, but also kind of unsatisfied. And so you have a big project ahead of you. Instead of focusing on the project, you start fantasizing about what it would be like to be somewhere else. You start thinking about, well, that other job would be so perfect. And instead of actually doing your work and making things better where you are, you end up losing valuable time by kind of losing yourself in this distraction, this fantasy of where you could be instead. Complaining, that can also be a great goal saboteur where you may find that you get frustrated. And so you spend a lot of time complaining, and that just absorbs your energy. It takes your focus away from solving the problem. It may reinforce your self-concept as a person who complains. And then lastly, I have frustration or impatience. And this is a tough one. And you might find this where, in particular, maybe you're trying to develop a new skill, or you are growing your practice and you're doing the business development and you are finding that you're putting in a lot of effort up front. However, you're not seeing the results that you want in a tangible, immediate way. And so sometimes that feeling of frustration, that feeling like it's taking too long, that feeling of impatience, that might be the 20% that then has you giving up on your bigger goals. So the idea here is simply to ask yourself, if you were to look at the goals that you have, what are the 20% that is causing you to lose out on the 80%? And maybe it's one of the saboteurs that I identified here. Maybe it's something else entirely. But what I would encourage you to do is to identify it and then expect it and simply stop letting them run the show. So if you know that you're going to get distracted when it's time to put your nose to the grindstone and get to work, then you can catch yourself and find strategies to bring yourself back on track. I've got lots of episodes about time management in this podcast series, so you're welcome to look to previous episodes for some ideas. it may be that one of the challenges that you're going to have is that you know that you are going to get distracted by the idea of a better option, that maybe you're going to start complaining. And so just notice that about yourself. And then when the urge comes up, when you find yourself complaining, limit that and move on. And what you'll find is that when you can lessen the effect of that 20%, when that 20% is no longer running the show, you have a lot more control over where you're focusing your energy, and you're going to be able to create those greater results. So again, what we've talked about today is this idea of perfectionism, right? Obsessing over every detail, wanting to do all tasks equally to the best of your ability, versus the Pareto Principle, where you're being strategic. You're thinking about the 20% that is causing the 80% results, and where can you use this principle to your advantage? We've talked about using it when it comes to time management. We've talked about using it when it comes to creating your relationships more intentionally. And we've talked about it in terms of identifying the 20% that's holding you back from your goals and dealing with that 20%. So the reason that the Pareto Principle is so effective is that it's really easy. It's a super simple formula. It sticks in your mind. And once you start using it as a lens, as a framework, it's easier to see where these ratios apply, right? You can look at a problem that you're having. You can ask you can list out all the tasks, for example, or all the problems that are relevant. And then you can start to see, well, where are the 20% that are causing the 80% of results? So it's a really effective way for you to prioritize those things that you want to focus on. It's also a really easy way to see that 80-20 rule. Where is the greatest cost to you? What are the 20% of problems that if you were to solve them would deal with 80% of the outcome? What is also effective about this is that once you start seeing results, then you will be motivated to do more. You may have noticed this, that when you've got something that is bothering you, whether it's a messy desk or it's a relationship that isn't quite working out, or you haven't been setting your boundaries effectively, when you start making tiny little steps of progress, right? Going back to that example of trying to improve your health, right? When you're able to make small tweaks, right? See a little bit of progress. You make it to the gym, you go for that run, you eat that healthy salad, you have that difficult conversation with your boss. As you take those tiny little steps, then you build momentum. You start to see results and you build that motivation. So if you're able to use Pareto to start making small shifts, then what you'll find is that will build on itself and you'll become increasingly motivated. Finally, it's also fun to practice, right? When you can actually use this framework, very straightforward, and start using it as a lens, then you're going to see where you have leverage. It becomes a bit of a game. Now, the skills that are required is number one, it's a willingness to investigate and acknowledge where perfectionism is holding you back, right? So you may find that there are areas of your practice, areas of your life where you are highly perfectionistic, and other areas where maybe it's not such a problem. This is going to help you see where perfectionism may be causing the most problems for you, right? It's a bit meta, but it's using that Pareto principle and applying it to perfectionism. Another skill that will be required of you is your willingness to experiment and adjust. So if being a perfectionist is really something that feels ingrained in how you approach your work and how you approach your relationships, it might feel a bit unsettling to start pushing things away or not doing things to the best of your ability, where that best of your ability has diminishing returns, right? That might feel unnatural to you, but as you experiment with it, you'll start to see how applying this priority lens will actually lead to a greater productivity and greater results for you. And of course, this means having a willingness to let go of your perfectionism in some cases and to save that perfectionism for areas where it's going to count the most. Now, what you will create as a result, well, you might find that you feel less fatigue. You're no longer extending yourself on all levels, and you're being more discerning in terms of the projects that you're focusing on. You're spending less time on those projects and in those relationships that are taking up a disproportionate amount of time relative to the outcomes that you're seeking. And that can help to avoid burnout. And it can also help you avoid that feeling like you're spinning your wheels, like you're pedaling really, really fast, but you're not getting anywhere, what you might also find is that the needle starts to move forward a lot faster at work. You're creating more impact and you're creating that impact faster because instead of obsessing over the 20 or the 80% of details that have 20% of the result, you're now focused on that 20% that is getting you 80% of the way there. You might also find that with that, you start to feel more confident. You enjoy your work more because you're now cultivating relationships intentionally with the clients who are your favorite clients. You're working more on your favorite projects and you're seeing the impact that you're making. And instead of focusing on, the 20% of the problems that are causing 80% of your stress and unhappiness, you're now looking at the 20% of the things that are within your control that you can do that are going to move the dial forward. So you can see how it's almost the mirror image, right? Instead of focusing on the lack with a perfectionistic lens, you're focused on the impact that you can make using that Pareto Principle. So thank you for sharing today's podcast episode with me. I hope you have enjoyed hearing about and learning about this beautiful concept and how you can apply it specifically to counterbalance perfectionistic tendencies. If you love this episode or you would like to share it with anybody, please go ahead and do that. Please also, if you haven't left a review for the podcast, wherever it is that you download your podcast, please do that. It helps others to find the podcast, and that would be absolutely amazing. So I wish you a fabulous week. I wish you a super fun time focusing on that 20%, and I look forward to reconnecting with you again next week. Bye for now. If you enjoyed today's show and don't want to miss an episode, subscribe and follow the show wherever you listen to your podcasts. If you haven't already, please leave a rating and review. Your feedback will help me create a podcast that's tailored to your needs and goes straight to the heart of what matters to you. For instructions on how to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast, visit www.thejoyfulpractice.com/podcast launch. See you next time. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast. If you want more information, visit www.thejoyfulpractice.com. See you next week.